The history of Africa is deeply intertwined with a legacy of exploitation, marginalization, and misinformation that has shaped global perceptions of the continent and its people. One of the greatest dehumanizing and horrifying lies ever told about Africans is the myth of their inherent inferiority. This falsehood has permeated centuries of historical discourse, serving as a justification for the enslavement, colonization, and continued systemic oppression of African people. The devastating consequences of this lie extend far beyond the past, leaving deep scars that persist in modern societies and still hinder the social, economic, and political advancement of African nations and their descendants. At the heart of this lie is the construction of Africa as a dark continent, a term coined by 19th-century European explorers and colonialists to suggest that Africa was a place of savagery, ignorance, and backwardness. This narrative deliberately disregarded the continent's complex civilizations, rich cultures, and intellectual achievements, instead portraying Africans as uncivilized, subhuman, and in need of Western intervention. The myth of African inferiority was a central component of the European imperialist project, used to justify the brutal colonization and exploitation of Africa's land, resources, and people. In the era of transatlantic slavery, this lie took on even more monstrous dimensions. Africans were cast as naturally suited for enslavement due to their supposed primitiveness and lack of moral and intellectual capacities. European traders, missionaries, and settlers used pseudo-scientific theories and biblical justifications to perpetuate the belief that Africans were an inferior race, created by God to serve white masters. The lie was reinforced through art, literature, and religious teachings that depicted Africans as barbaric, animalistic beings who lacked the qualities of humanity, such as reason, emotion, and the capacity for civilization. These images of Africans were ingrained in the European psyche, leading to centuries of systemic racism, which continues to echo in the modern world. The dehumanization of Africans was further institutionalized by European scholars who embraced scientific racism, a pseudo-discipline that sought to prove the biological inferiority of African people. In the 18th and 19th centuries, European scientists like Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, Samuel Morton, and Louis Agassiz popularized racial hierarchies that placed Africans at the bottom of the human species. These so-called scientific studies measured skull sizes and facial features, linking physical traits with intellectual and moral characteristics. Africans were consistently labeled as subhuman in these studies, contributing to the global acceptance of white supremacy and the justification of slavery, segregation, and colonialism. Perhaps one of the most horrifying aspects of this lie is the way it seeped into the very fabric of African societies under colonial rule. African people were systematically stripped of their dignity, culture, and self-worth through policies that enforced the notion of African inferiority. Colonizers established education systems that promoted European history and achievements, while denigrating African heritage and contributions. African languages were suppressed, traditional religions were demonized, and African leaders were either killed or manipulated into serving colonial interests. In this context, African people were made to internalize the belief that they were inferior, unworthy of self-governance, and incapable of creating their own futures. The psychological damage of these colonial ideologies persists to this day, manifesting in the ongoing challenges of identity, unity, and self-determination within African countries. The lie of African inferiority was not only a European invention. It was supported and perpetuated by Arab traders and rulers who participated in the trans-Saharan slave trade for centuries. Just as European slavers dehumanized Africans, so too did Arab traders view African people as mere commodities. The notion of African inferiority justified the enslavement of millions of Africans in the Arab world, where they were subjected to brutal labor, forced conversions, and cultural erasure. These long-standing prejudices against Africans became deeply ingrained in parts of the Middle East and North Africa, further complicating Africa's historical and contemporary relationships with its neighbors to the north. The horror of this lie extends into the 20th and 21st centuries, where its echoes can be seen in modern global structures of inequality. The economic exploitation of Africa continued after the formal end of colonialism, as multinational corporations, corrupt governments, and international financial institutions kept African countries in a state of dependency. Africa was portrayed as a continent of chaos, war, and poverty, often neglecting the historical and external forces that created these conditions. The narrative of African inferiority remained alive, influencing international policies and attitudes that regarded Africa as a charity case, incapable of solving its own problems without Western intervention. The image of Africa as a backward and uncivilized place also fueled the cultural appropriation and commodification of African cultures by the West. African art, music, and traditions were often stripped of their original meanings and used as exotic backdrops in Western fashion, film, and entertainment industries. African spiritual practices were dismissed as primitive, even as they were repackaged in various forms for consumption by Western audiences. This continued dehumanization of African culture perpetuates the myth that African contributions to world civilization are marginal, primitive, or secondary. The psychological toll of this dehumanizing lie is perhaps its most insidious legacy. The false narrative of African inferiority created a generational trauma that affects people of African descent all over the world. In the diaspora, African Americans, Afro-Caribbeans, Afro-Latinos, and others have been forced to grapple with a history that tells them they are lesser, both in their homeland and abroad. The myth of inferiority fueled racist policies like Jim Crow, apartheid, and segregation, while also shaping the self-perception of African peoples in a world that constantly told them they were worth less than others. This global structure of anti-Blackness remains one of the most enduring legacies of the lie about African inferiority. Undoing this lie requires not only confronting the historical facts, but also reclaiming African identities, histories, and futures. For centuries, African civilizations like ancient Egypt, Nubia, Great Zimbabwe, and the Kingdom of Mali made significant contributions to science, mathematics, philosophy, and the arts, yet these achievements were ignored or misattributed by European historians. Today, there is a growing movement among African scholars, artists, and leaders to reclaim Africa's history from the margins, emphasizing the continent's role as a foundational part of human civilization. African languages, spiritualities, and knowledge systems are being revitalized, offering a new generation of Africans the opportunity to define their futures on their own terms, rather than through the lens of Western narratives. The truth about Africa is not one of inferiority or backwardness, but of resilience, strength, and enduring cultural richness. The greatest dehumanizing and horrifying lie ever told about Africans has cost countless lives and continues to shape the global order, but cannot erase the profound contributions African people have made to the world. The fight to reclaim African dignity and dispel the myths of inferiority is ongoing, and it is a battle that touches every corner of the globe where African people and their descendants continue to rise against the weight of this deeply rooted falsehood. By confronting this lie, the world can begin to acknowledge the full humanity of Africans, honoring their histories, cultures, and futures with the respect and dignity that has been denied for far too long.